So this is Epstein. He is a philosopher who applies big picture, humanistic thinking to industrial and environmental controversies. In 2011, he founded the Center for Industrial Progress, a for-profit think tank and communications consulting firm focused on energy and environmental issues. In 2014, Epstein wrote The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which has been widely praised as the most persuasive argument made for the use of coal, oil, and natural gas. It became a New York Times bestseller and earned him the 2014 Most Original Thinker awarded by the McLaughlin Group. Epstein's greatest strength is persuading those with an undecided opinion about fossil fuels. He writes to the public in a regular Forbes column and has been published in hundreds of publications, including the Wall Street Journal. Epstein has guest lectured at dozens of universities, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Duke, and has used his philosophical approach of reframing issues to influence the thinking of thousands of students. He teaches his method of persuasion and constructive conversation to Energy Association members and company executives and employees in the forms of speeches, consulting, training courses, including his latest course, How to Talk to Anyone About Energy. Epstein believes that if the industry reframes the morality of energy as an issue not of minimizing human impact, but of maximizing human flourishing, it can become a confident champion for energy and freedom. So, without further ado, Alex.
Quick poll. 3 options. So the question is basically, what do you think about fossil fuels? And this poll is off limits to anyone who has read my book. Some of you in the front row are missing. Okay? So the options are going to be called unnecessary evil, necessary evil, and superior good. So I'll explain each of those. So unnecessary evil, somebody mentioned Al Gore from the outset, that would be his view. This is fossil fuels are a self-destructive addiction that are destroying our planet, and we can rapidly replace them with things like solar and wind and other forms of so-called green energy. Necessary evil is fossil fuels are a self-destructive addiction, but it's going to take many, many decades to get off of them. This is often what you hear from the oil industry. And then superior good is that fossil fuels are, we could say, like steel or aluminum. We use them because they're the best for what they do, and we hope somebody finds something better someday, but we're proud to use them because we think they're good and we're happy to use them for decades to come. Okay, so we've got unnecessary evil, necessary evil, and superior good. So who would say unnecessary evil? Okay, unnecessary evil. And necessary evil. Okay, superior good. That's the highest number I've ever gotten. When I disqualified people who have read my book. All right. Good. So we've got a good mixture, and that should make for some good questions and some good critical thinking. So what I want to talk about tonight is not what I would call the full moral case for why I think fossil fuels are a superior good. But one aspect of the energy issue that I think is very important. I was mentioned in my bio that my background is as a philosopher. I didn't come into this as somebody who supported fossil fuels. I, in fact, grew up in a very anti-fossil fuel environment in the DC area. I never learned anything positive about fossil fuels in school. I worked in the industry. But I was really passionate about philosophy. And philosophy is all about how do we think carefully about the most important choices in life. And when I started looking at how we thought about energy, I thought there are a lot of just really illogical things that we do when we think about energy. For example, sometimes when we talk about fossil fuels versus green energy, we only talk about, say, the negatives of fossil fuels. Like maybe people will talk about, oh, the dangers of coal mining, but only the positives of green energy. And yet when I looked at something like windmills or wind turbines, I learned that the mining practices for those were more dangerous than the mining practices for coal mining. So that doesn't mean that one or the other is bad, but it just means we don't tend to look at it in a very balanced way. We don't tend to look at it in a very careful way. And I think if we don't do that, then we're bound to come to really bad conclusions. Another example would be, say, sea level rise. People say fossil fuels cause sea level rise, but they're often really unclear about how big the sea level rise is. But whenever we're thinking about something carefully, we need to know how big it is, because a sea level rise of a foot or two in 100 years, which is what the UN actually projects, that's a fairly normal thing in the history of the planet. Whereas, say, 20 feet in several decades, which is what Al Gore says, that would be an extraordinary thing. So depending on how big the sea level rise would be, that would determine whether, hey, is this a superior good? Is this an unnecessary evil? Is it a necessary evil? So the issue I want to talk about tonight is, I think, maybe the most neglected issue in our discussion of our future energy choices, but I think is incredibly, incredibly important. This is the issue that I call, but that is called energy poverty. So I'll start out just with a story. It's a story when I was researching the moral case for fossil fuels about a baby in the country, the Gambia, which is a country in Africa, a very poor country. And a mother had a child who was premature, about 3.5 pounds. Now, in the United States, if you have a 3.5 pound baby, it's cause for some concern, but fortunately we have modern technology, and in particular, we have incubation technology. We have incubators, and so you can have an incubator, you can put the baby in a comfortable environment, and the baby has a very good chance of surviving. But in the Gambia, in this hospital, they had no incubators. You might ask, why not? Is it just because they can't afford it? We could just give them an incubator and they'd be fine? Well, no, because the incubator requires something that they don't have in that hospital and they don't have throughout the country, which is cheap, plentiful, reliable electricity. And so without electricity that's reliable to run the incubator, there's no point in having an incubator, it won't work, and so they don't have incubators. And this particular baby died. And this happens around the world every day. People die from lack of energy that they need. Now, to give you a contrast, this in the US, this is a picture of my friend and his child. He had a child that was born much more underweight in a much worse situation than the baby in the Gambia. But he had the good fortune to live in the United States of America. And so his baby had all sorts of complications, but at every stage, they had the technology to overcome them. Of course, they had incubators, but they also had helicopters to fly the baby from a great hospital to the absolute best hospital if that's what they needed. It was just this incredible technological marvel. And by the end of it, this baby had used so much modern technology, so many resources in effect, you might say, but the baby lived. And what my friend said, my friend works in the oil industry, he said something really profound, which is he had a picture of his son, and his son's foot was tiny, and he put it next to a quarter. They were the same size, and he said, his feet are tiny, but his carbon footprint is already huge. So what's the significance of this? Well, the significance of this is that energy is much more important than most of us are taught to think. Because energy is the fuel that powers every machine in civilization, from an incubator to a tractor. And the more energy we have, the more work we can do, the more productive we can be, the more we can flourish as human beings. If we don't have energy, we go back to being a manual labor society instead of a machine labor society, and basically our whole standard of living disappears. And so this example of this baby, the two different babies, just shows the difference between having a lot of energy and having a little energy, or almost no energy. And you might ask, well, how big a deal is this? And looking at the papers, you might not think it's a big deal. I don't look at papers, probably most of you don't either, but I do look at Facebook feeds, and I look at Twitter. And one thing I find that's really interesting is at no point, I see lots of things on energy, I see lots of things on climate, I see lots of things on pollution. I don't remember ever seeing any feed ever on energy poverty. But yet this is something that causes babies to die, and you might think this isn't that big a deal. Well, actually, it's an insanely big deal because over 1 billion people in the world don't have any electricity. So think about that. Over 1 billion people have no electricity at all. So to give you a sense of that, that would be the equivalent, that's the same number of people as if you cut off the power of every single person in the United States, every single person in Canada, and every single person in Europe. That's how many people have no electricity. You think that's a pretty big deal. And it gets worse than that, because 3 times that many people have almost no energy by our standards. They might be able to operate a radio or a flashlight, but they basically can do almost none of the things in modern civilization. And yet we don't talk about it at all. So today, that's why I wanted to focus on this, because I think this is a huge moral issue, and I think that fossil fuels are very crucial to solving it. And if we don't think about that, if we don't take that seriously, we can end up making decisions that hurt a lot of people without realizing it. So I'm going to talk today about energy poverty, and then what I think causes it, and why we don't really care about it, and then how to fight it. So I'm going to divide this into three categories. I think we undervalue energy. I think we undervalue efficient energy industries. And then we restrict the most efficient energy industries. So I'll break each of those down. So we undervalue energy, we undervalue efficient energy industries, and then we restrict the efficient energy industries. So one is we undervalue energy or energy abundance. So energy abundance is my term for basically everyone in the world having access to cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, whether in the form of electricity, whether in the form of fuel to heat your home, fuel to move your car. But that's what I mean by energy abundance. I think it's worth realizing that we don't actually appreciate energy very much. And this is a big source of dispute. I remember a couple years ago, I was giving a guest lecture at Stanford, and this guy invited me to speak. And in the middle of my speech, I was explaining the value of energy, I'm about to explain. In the middle, he cut me off, which you're not supposed to do with guest lecturers. And he said, Alex, everyone in the class knows this. Everybody knows that energy is important. Shut up, basically. And I said, well, actually, I don't think you know. I know you don't know it, otherwise you wouldn't have stopped me. And then I explained what I'm about to explain here. So energy, in physics class, you learn something to the effect of energy is a capacity to do more. The way to think of it is basically, in our context, is energy is machine food. So humans need food to do work, to be productive, to move around, and so do all of our machines. Right? Whether it's an iPad, whether it's a tractor, incubator, it needs food. And basically, the more food or fuel we have for machines, the more machines can do work for us. And we can have all the machines in the world, but if they don't have fuel, what happens? They're just scrap metal. They're useless. So no matter how much we advance technologically as a society, unless we have energy to move all of the machines in society, all of those machines are useless. So that the key difference is, do you live in a manual labor economy where we do all of our work physically, where we're very weak and we live very short lives, or do we live in a machine labor economy? And then the more advanced the machine labor economy, the more energy that it ends up using. And so what the energy industry's job is it has to figure out, how do I produce as much of this energy as cheaply as possible, as safely as possible, as cleanly as possible, and as we'll see in a minute, this is a very, very hard thing to do, and very few energy industries can pull it off. Many fewer can pull it off than say they can pull it off. So we're going to talk about four aspects, four things that energy gives us, and I'm going to ask you to fill these in, that are really underappreciated. So basically, how does energy abundance affect the following? So the first is food. How does having cheap, plentiful, reliable energy affect our food supply? And feel free to raise your hand if you want. Yes?
It allows us to have one farmer for 100 people or something like that, with 13-row planters and large harvesting machines and semi-trailer trucks to carry the food from the farm, an individual farm, to an elevator.
Yeah, so you just covered a lot of it. I mean, the really revealing statistic is, let's say 9 out of 10 people in the past were farmers. That was a manual labor economy. We were basically so weak and so inept that all we could do in life was get our food to live the next day. And then often we couldn't do that and we'd die.
It's an annual crop usually.
Yeah. But, I mean, yeah, in effect, yeah, it goes year to year. But, of course, you can run out any given day. But, yeah, so from year to year, you can, people were barely good enough at being productive to feed themselves. And sometimes when they had too many kids, they would starve. They would literally feast or famine. And the kinds of things you mentioned have taken us totally away from that. So not only are we not afraid of going hungry, our biggest problem in this society is obesity. We're not afraid of going hungry, very few of us have to work as farmers. And the reason is because we have these amazing machines that can do all our work for us and can do all our work far better than we ever could ourselves. So for example, think about like reaping wheat, to make bread. So a modern harvester that runs on diesel fuel can reap enough wheat for 500,000 loaves of bread a day. Think about it, 500,000, it's doubtful the whole campus could do that. And this is one machine, and it's one machine powered by affordable energy. There's other aspects too, like how come there's a lot less problem with drought and crops getting water? Because we now have irrigation, we now have water filtration, things like that. So it's just really remarkable how having energy, when somebody says, oh, I want to make energy more expensive or energy is too cheap, if you make energy more expensive, you make food more expensive. And that will always hurt the poorest people the most. All right, how about knowledge? Another objection I sometimes get is, I'll point out that if you look at the correlation between energy use in a country and life expectancy in a country, it's very, very high. And somebody will say, well, those really have nothing to do with each other, that's just a coincidence, because the real thing that drives up life expectancy from 30 to 75 or 80 is medical knowledge. We have a lot more medical knowledge, we have a lot more technologies, we've done all this research. So how does that relate to energy? How does energy make that possible? Yes?
Well, people aren't working on the farm, they have time to study and experiment and get started.
Yeah, so to the extent you're doing manual labor all day, you don't have much time to do mental labor. So the more our machines do manual labor for us, so not just farming, but pretty much every aspect of life, once that happens, then we have tons and tons of time free to think. And it becomes a virtuous circle because we have tons of time free to think. And one thing we can think about is how to produce better forms of energy, how to produce machines. So if you notice, if you look at progress, it's very, very, very slow for 100,000 plus years. And then it takes off. And a huge amount of the reason that it takes off is because once we free ourselves from enough manual labor, we get to do mental labor, and that just keeps compounding and compounding and compounding. But without all the energy to free us up from that, we can't do. Okay, the next one, and here we've gotten some non-student answers. I want some students to help with this one. So how does energy help clean water? Because clean water is often thought of as something that energy ruins. People are afraid of fracking because they think it might contaminate the water. We hear about mines contaminating the water. We don't really ever hear about energy helping clean water. Any thoughts from the students? Yes? Oh, wait, who was, oh, you.
Water treatment plants.
Okay, elaborate. Water treatment plants?
Filter water and move it around too.
Okay, we can filter water, move it around. Yes?
I just had a question to clarify.
Of course.
Are you talking about energy in the context of fossil fuels right now?
No, we're just talking about, that's a great question. No, we're just talking about any form of energy. We'll talk about fossil fuels later. Fossil fuels are, so the part of the question is going to be, do we need fossil fuels to get this much energy? But now we're just talking about any kind of energy that's cheap, plentiful, and reliable. Good question. Yeah, so you mentioned to purify the water. Yeah, so nature doesn't give us an abundant supply of clean water, despite what we're taught. It's not like there's vast water just flowing everywhere in the world. In fact, most societies are desperate for clean water and go to huge lengths to get even mildly dirty water. So nature doesn't give us anywhere near enough clean water, so what we have to do is we have to figure out how to filter the dirty water, how to purify it, and we need to figure out how to move it from where it is to where we need it. And both of those are very energy-intensive processes. So when people talk about, it's okay if we raise the price of energy, why don't we switch from this energy to this energy, why don't we impose a tax on energy, that makes the cost of clean water higher. And again, it's always higher to the poorest people, or it's preventing the poorest people from having access to clean water in the first place. So here's the kind of graph you might see. You won't see this, but unless you read Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, but we should see it more. You'll see as we use more energy, we tend to get more clean water, and there are real causes there. How about this last one? Climate safety. So the biggest concern that we hear about, a particular type of energy, fossil fuels, is CO2 causing problems in climate. We've discussed that. But how does any form of energy, if it's cheap, plentiful, reliable, help us be safe from climate? This is a point that's almost never made. Yes?
It makes things warmer a bit.
It makes things warmer? How?
Sorry.
You mean through global warming? Or through heating a home?
I was kind of referring to heating a home.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. So you think about one of the biggest climate-related problems in history, actually a much bigger problem than being too warm is being too cold. Even to this day, there are twice as many people who die from it being too cold than it being too warm. So freezing has historically been a huge problem, and what we can do using energy is we can actually change our very, very local climate, right? We can change the atmosphere in this room to go from very uncomfortable to comfortable, particularly if we got later in the year here. And that's, we have, so in terms of climate change, one way to think of it is we actually change our climate all the time in terms of making the local atmosphere hospitable. So that's a huge one. Any other example? So that alone heating alone saves tens of millions of lives a year. Anyone else? Oh, only students still. Oh.
Provides us with shelter. You need energy to produce the wood and the steel and everything.
Yeah, it provides us shelter. So we take a look at what recently happened, in the southeast. Probably all of us know somebody who was affected by that hurricane. You have deaths. I don't know what the latest toll is, but I think the dozens was the last I saw. You can have tropical storms historically that kill tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And one of the reasons is they don't have a durable civilization. So to have a durable civilization, you need a lot of energy to build up, make these amazing materials, build these durable buildings. So one thing you'll see in this stat right here, which is really interesting, which is that it turns out that even though for the last 35 years, it's been predicted that rising CO2 emissions will lead to a drastic decline in climate safety. So climate safety, the statistic is called climate-related deaths. It means how many people die by storms and floods and extreme heat and extreme cold and wildfires. They actually have a number for that they track every year. And the reason you don't hear about the number is because it completely contradicts most people's theory about what the number should be. And unfortunately, most people come up with theories that are contradicted. They're not honest about what happens. So for example, the number one science advisor to our president, John Holdren, predicted in 1985 that by the year 2020, we'd have 1 billion climate-related deaths from famine due to CO2. And if you look at this, you see what actually has happened is as we've used more fossil fuels, which is just to the point before, it's really just more energy, climate-related deaths have fallen dramatically because nature doesn't give us a safe climate at all. This is a very dangerous climate, we make it safe. So this doesn't mean we don't have to worry about CO2. We need to study CO2. But what it does mean is that if you care about people's safety from climate, and then you talk about raising the price of energy, you're committing a huge contradiction. Because as important as anything to people's safety from climate is that they have the energy and the technology to protect themselves, because nature is not your friend. They talk about the climate as if it's this thing with a smile, but it's very variable, it's volatile and vicious, it wants to kill you, and we need lots of energy and lots of technology to prevent it. So you can see just aggregate things. Another, I think, symptom of our bias is we don't talk about the positive aspects with energy poverty. So you look at China and India, you see dramatic increases in life expectancy as they've used a lot more fossil fuels. Now we'll talk in a minute, why are we using fossil fuels? Do we really need to use fossil fuels? But that's their dominant form of energy by far. And then you see dramatic increases in income. And people, when they talk about China, they tend to focus on only the negatives and not the positives. So I think that's a problematic bias, particularly if there are reasons to think that with things like smog, you can deal with a lot of the negatives through technology. All right, so cause number one was the undervalued energy. So one reason we don't talk about energy poverty is because people don't realize how important cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is for things like food and clean water and climate safety and knowledge. If they did, they'd be really alarmed when people said, hey, we need to make energy more expensive, or we need to impose a tax on CO2, or we need to mandate this more expensive form of energy, because they realize, oh, that's going to make everything else in life more expensive. But the second cause is that we undervalue the industries that are efficient. And by efficient, I mean those that can produce energy cheaply, plentifully, and reliably. So this is the actual distribution of energy in the world. So you can see, I use 1980 because that's the year I was born. And in 1980, just like today, people were saying, yeah, we should get off fossil fuels. We're using too many, we should use less. And as you can see, that generation, my parents' generation, completely ignored all of that advice. And we use more fossil fuels than ever. We use more than 80% more than we used to. So the question is, why? Did we really need to do that? Or is there some conspiracy, or has it changed now and solar and wind are just as good or better? And, you know, what I learned in school was pretty much what this cartoon says, which is, this is the unnecessary evil view of fossil fuels. It's basically, look, if we restrict fossil fuels and people talk about let's outlaw 80% in the next 3 decades, it's no problem, because even if there isn't a big problem with CO2 and climate, even if it turns out that's not a big deal, we'll still be better off because we'll be using green, renewable energy. And as Al Gore said, it's free and forever. Right? Green, renewable energy, it's free and forever because it's the sun and the wind, right? And the sun and the wind are natural, and they're free, and they're forever, at least 5 billion years or so. So why doesn't that work? And I think this is I know this is a really dishonest argument. And the person who's going to uncover it, do we have audio capabilities here?
Yep. Just click the mouse.
Hopefully Jimmy Fallon will uncover it. So Jimmy Fallon is going to talk about another form of renewable energy, which is renewable energy, proposed renewable energy from hazelnuts.
New Scientist magazine reported on Wednesday that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs.
Okay, well, so how is that relevant? Well, but wait a second. Isn't hazelnut energy renewable energy? It just comes from the sun, right? The sun is free and forever. So why is hazelnut? Any students or pre-students want to take why is hazelnut energy so expensive? Yes?
It's not abundant.
Well, why isn't it abundant? The sun is abundant.
There's not hazelnuts growing everywhere.
But why not? We think we can make solar panels grow everywhere. What's that?
Climate doesn't always conducive to the growing of hazelnuts.
Okay, yeah, that's part of it. Yes?
It also takes a lot of water to grow things like nuts, and so it wouldn't be even sustainable when it comes to the environment because of the amount of water that would go through that process.
Right.
And it would be expensive because of the resources that are needed to create hazelnuts.
Okay, so I think that especially the last part of what you said is the key. So the resources that are needed to create hazelnuts, and therefore hazelnut energy. People have this really wrong view of nature, which I like to call earth worship, which is that, and I think we're taught it, and this is largely supposedly secular movement, although it's a religion, I think, which is that nature and the earth is perfect, and all we can do is ruin it. That's the basic thing. So when people talk about the climate, they talk about it as like this nice thing. When they talk about the environment, they talk about it as this clean thing, even though if you look at the climate, it's not nice, and the environment isn't clean, absent us doing a lot of stuff. And when people talk about natural energy and energy from the earth, they seem to think that the earth just gives us usable energy. But the earth doesn't give us usable energy at all. That's why we didn't have good machine energy until about 300 years ago. All the earth gives us is the raw material for energy. So it gives us something like sun, gives us sun, but we need land, and we need to put together all these different inputs to make it into energy. So you have to look at what do we have to mine, what do we have to process, what do we have to manufacture, what do we have to transport, how do we maintain it, how do we dispose of it. So every form of energy is not just a single material like coal or the sun, it's a process involving many, many different materials. And it's very, very difficult to find a process that you can do efficiently for billions and billions of people. And that's really the challenge of alleviating energy poverty. And industry has to have a process that can work for billions and billions of people. So I remember a guy I met once, and he was bragging to me about how he's going to solve all the world's energy problems. And his solution was he was going to produce a form of alcohol fuel, a form of ethanol, from the residue from beer. And I said, well, if you can, and he said I could do this for $2 a gallon. I said, great, but I really hope that Americans don't drink enough beer for that to scale, right? So the reason that it would work is because people had already paid all the money for the beer, and then the residue wasn't that expensive. But it wouldn't work, it wouldn't scale if you had to grow all those crops purely for the purpose of making the thing. Anyone, by the way, as a kind of funny side note, anyone, some of you might get this. This guy's name was ironically John Galt. Any Ayn Rand fans? Didn't deserve it. So, this point is really important, that energy is a process. Think of every form of energy as a manufacturing process and think, has the industry come up with a good process? To say the sun is free for solar is as meaningless or useful as saying, well, the oxygen is free for burning. It's only one part of the process. Yes?
What's the process for turning solar power into energy? What are the resources used?
Perfect time. I'll talk about that right now in the context of Germany. So Germany is the leader. So if we're going to talk about solar and wind, like what kind of process is involved there? So Germany is the world leader at spending a lot of money on solar and wind, which are portrayed as free and forever. And so what this shows is, this is the most, we got this from the German government, the most specific data we could get on how much of their electricity are they actually getting from solar panels and windmills. So you can see on the bottom, the solar is the black, and then the wind is the gray, and these add them up. So how much are you getting at any given time? And what you see there is you see a lot of spikes. And these spikes allow people to be really dishonest if they so choose, because at any point in the spike, it might spike up for a second or a minute, and then it might produce 40% of what's needed. And then a certain interest, Al Gore might tweet and say, Germany gets 40% of its electricity from solar and wind. But that's very misleading, because I would say, well, what second did you get that statistic from? Because you notice at other seconds or on other days, it gets almost none. And so this then goes to the process. I'll go to the core process in a second of how it's generated. But part of the issue with any solar and wind thing is that it deals with what's called an intermittent or unreliable input. So if you have an intermittent or unreliable input, and that input can almost always can go to zero at a certain point, how much backup do you need for it? If it can always go to zero.
100%.
You need 100%. So you need to build 100% reliable infrastructure. So for every piece of unreliable infrastructure, you need to build reliable infrastructure. So I think of it as, you have a company, right? And you've got this one employee that comes in, exactly at the right time, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and he charges you $10 an hour. And then another one says, well, I'm a better employee, I'm more natural, I'm more renewable, and I'm going to charge you $8 an hour, but I'm only going to come in 12 hours a week, and I'm not going to tell you which hours I'm going to come. Well, you still have to have the first employee, and the second one is really just going to be a pain. It's going to be producing energy at all these particular times. So when people talk about, there are two fallacies when people talk about solar and wind. So one is they ignore the process of it, which is very intensive because it requires mining certain things, mining certain metals and materials, and then manufacturing them and ultimately disposing of them. And if you're dealing with roofs, that's lots of manual labor. It requires lots of different transmission lines to have them backed up. And so if you look at any solar textbook, you can see every little step of it. But the point is, it's a huge manufacturing process in and of itself. But that manufacturing process doesn't end up with the reliable worker. It ends up with the unreliable worker. So that means you need another manufacturing process on top of that, either to build the reliable worker or to build, in effect, a storage system. Like some way of storing all of that unreliable energy so that then you can deploy it reliably. And to give you an indication of how much resources that requires, we can just refer to the fact that in the entire world there is not one independent solar or wind plant that attempts to do this. So every single use of solar and wind in the world on a significant scale is done by having a reliable source as a backup. So I refer to the energies not as renewable and non-renewable, but as reliable and unreliable. One interesting question that to think about, and then this will come up at the end, is why the opponents of fossil fuel energy tend to oppose two technologies in particular, nuclear power and hydroelectric power. Because those are two forms of power that can produce energy relatively cheaply, plentifully, and reliably, and at least in the case of nuclear, for billions of people. And yet, the opponents of fossil fuels hate nuclear almost as much, even though it has no carbon. So it's an interesting question to think about. But if we look at, the, I think, the big picture, the fossil fuel industry is the only one that's demonstrably able to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for billions of people. Hydroelectric is limited because you only have so many locations you can do it. And then nuclear is limited, it doesn't produce fuel for transportation yet. Nuclear is more limited, although we don't really know how good it could be because it's been so restricted by the same people who oppose fossil fuels. So one of the lessons to draw is not only are fossil fuels good to allow happen, but we need to start allowing nuclear to happen instead of restricting it. It's a big question. Why are the people who claim to care about CO2, and they obviously don't if they're against nuclear, why are they so focused on the unreliables and against the reliable non-carbon forms of energy? So I'll ask that in a minute, but then let's get to the third thing. So the third cause, so we don't value energy, we don't value the efficient energy industries, and therefore we restrict the most efficient energy industries. So this is the basic equation. Using
is this in the U.S.?
No, this is global.
Global.
This is global, yes. So the benefits of using more fossil fuels. So this doesn't mean there are no risks that we should consider, but when we consider the risks, we need to consider that people having access to fossil fuels versus not is a matter of billions of people's well-being. So if somebody says, well, I'm concerned about CO2, we absolutely need to look at that and investigate how big a deal that is. But it's very important you realize that there are trade-offs. So if you say, well, I think CO2 is a problem, it better be a really big problem if you're going to restrict fossil fuels at this point, because that is guaranteed to make people's lives worse. And again, so I'm happy to tell you a lot about what I think about CO2 in the question period, but again, it doesn't quite capture it. It's not a plausible explanation of why we don't care about energy poverty to say we care so much about CO2. Because again, the same people who are opposed to CO2, or who are opposed to fossil fuels, largely oppose nuclear and hydro. So here's my concluding thought and question. We have this massive problem in the world. Nobody seems to care about it. Nobody values the industries, including the non-carbon industries, that could help prevent it. We're restricting them. Nobody cares about that. And so what's going on? Why is this? Again, it can't just. Some people I know are concerned about the climate issue, but it can't be that because again they wouldn't oppose nuclear and hydro. So does anyone have any thoughts on why this is? I think it's a really important question. Why we don't care about billions of people suffering? It's not on our Facebook feeds. It's nowhere. It's certainly not discussed. I got one of the major newspapers. I think this will be out on Thursday. Asked me to write something about the election and climate change and should it be discussed. And I thought it was just interesting. There would be a 0% chance they would ask if energy poverty should be discussed. And by the way, energy poverty isn't just among the absolute poorest. In the countries that are more and more using green energy, it's becoming a problem. Like in Germany, energy poverty is now part of the lexicon. And their electricity is 3 to 4 times more expensive than ours, even though it's supposedly free and forever. So why don't we care? This is a real question. To students.
Why don't we care about climate change, or is that what you're...
No, I assume I think people at least pretend to care about that more than anything. No, why do we care about energy poverty? Why are we so willing to ignore it or to restrict the sources of energy that would help alleviate it? Yes.
We're not taught to think about that stuff.
Okay, so what, we're not taught to think about it, so what do you mean we're not taught? Like in what form?
Through universities, there's like public information, media.
So why, so universities like to think of themselves as very smart. So why aren't they, and very humanitarian? I mean, I never heard, universities publicly say, we don't care about poor people. So why don't they care? Do you have something?
I guess I was just going to say, I've never heard anyone say we should be denying energy resources to developing countries. I've only heard it in the context of a country similar to the US that already has a lot of resources and is using them. So I guess I would say I have heard about billions of people suffering, but more discussing whether they have food and water resources and technologies related to that. So I don't know, that's my personal reflection. I haven't heard the term energy poverty, so I agree with you there, but I think the dialogue that I've heard is more on human survival as related to nutrition, and I guess I haven't heard of fossil fuels as being denied for developing countries in the context that you're seeing.
So a couple of interesting things there. One is not hearing about things like food and water and technology in the context of energy, because energy is more fundamental than those in a real sense, because that's the industry that makes possible all the other industries. So part of the piece, which I mentioned before, is we don't value it. In terms of the denial, I mean, it's partially so not focusing on it as a problem. In terms of denial, there is an entire movement of not just ignoring it, but, so I mean, this is the way it works. If you take, like the poorest person is always the person who's like, whatever the lowest price of something is, so let's say, gasoline is $2 a gallon, it's like the poorest person is always hurt when that goes up, right? So what we have is we have a worldwide discussion where people are saying the cost of fossil fuels is too low, we need to drive the price up. So for instance, have you guys heard of keep it in the ground? This expression, keep it in the ground? Well, so keeping anything in the ground, given the same demand, is going to drive the price up. So what I'm saying here is people are saying, hey, keep it in the ground, this thing that would be these people's best hope of living. And we don't seem to care about it and don't seem to think about it. So any other thoughts on why we don't value this, and particularly our brilliant professors at our brilliant universities? You could probably sense a little sarcasm. But I think the university system has certain fraudulent aspects, and not caring about major issues in human life is one of them. And caring about superficial politically correct issues instead. Yes?
I think it's a little bit of a fallacy to say that nobody cares about energy poverty. I think it's more likely that people, when they look at fossil fuels, they don't think that they'll be able to scale. If we were to achieve energy abundance, how much more fossil fuels would we have to find, would we have to deploy, would we have to use, and will that be sustainable for the long term? So it's not that they don't care, it's that they don't think that the current solution is scalable to the degree that we need to achieve energy surplus, be able to get it for abundance for everybody, and that there'll be serious climate downsides if that happens.
Okay, so if that were the case, first of all, you would expect people to actually say that, and then it could be debated, and I mean, that side of the debate would lose very badly. If you looked at it, already has, so from two perspectives. One is from the nuclear perspective, which is very important to keep in mind, that people are not supporting nuclear solutions. So again, the climate thing is a fraud, that that's what they care about. It doesn't mean the issue is fraudulent, it means their concern about it is a mask for something else. So nuclear has no supply issues for any amount of time that's relevant to the human condition. Fossil fuels, they used to talk about peak oil, but what always happens is what people are confused about is they equate the amount of oil that we have basically in inventory with the amount of oil supply in the earth, which is just absolutely unfathomable. And so what we're always doing is finding new technology to chip off very small bits of that unfathomable whole. And so now, we're not running out of oil, we're running into oil. So nobody is that particular concern was fashionable 5 years ago by people who didn't understand economics. And I would say those of us who did understand economics and wrote about it said you don't understand economics. And then what happened is as soon as that got refuted, then they just said, well, we still hate it. We don't hate it because there's not enough, we hate it because there's too much. But right now, the fashionable thing is to hate it because there's too much, not because there's not enough. Any other thoughts on why? And by care, by the way, for me, care means act. So think about it and act. And so, I see all these people talk about, like, let's divest from fossil fuels, let's restrict them, and they feel so good about themselves, and nobody can challenge their moral authority. And what I'm saying is, you have no moral authority, you don't know what you're doing, and you're not considering who are the first victims of you making fossil fuel energy more expensive. Yes?
To play a bit of devil's advocate, I feel like people would argue that if using fossil fuels and like kind of setting nuclear energy aside, but specifically referring to fossil fuels, if someone were to argue that it's going to lead to the downfall of the human race and could end us ultimately, that it would be foolish to try and save that many people.
This
if it's
is
gonna be
nuclear or fossil fuels?
Specifically fossil fuels.
But then why oppose nuclear?
Well, that's why I said we should set that to the side, because
But that's a really dishonest devil, right? Because the devil, I want the devil's advocate, but I want him to actually, he has to defend his own view.
Yeah, okay. So
again, I'm saying that if you think, the more you think this is an apocalyptic problem, the more you advocate the obvious solution of nuclear.
Yes.
So they don't, and they don't care.
Okay.
So it's like we want to take away your fossil fuels, and we are still against nuclear, and we don't care if you starve, but we feel really good about ourselves, so we're going to go protest in the street and write divestment on things. In the back. You.
When talking about nuclear, though, if you look at the people who have to live by the nuclear plants, they disproportionately end up with cancer at higher rates than other people. So I'm assuming that's kind of the main reason for nuclear, why people don't want to use it, as far as the safety concern.
I think it's really important to think through these things seriously. Like, let's say that were true, which it isn't. But let's say it were true. Move the people farther away from the plants. How hard is this to imagine? It's not like a bomb. It doesn't have this huge radius.
It's not that easy, though, for people just to get up and move.
Is it that easy for billions of people to die?
Well, I wouldn't say. I mean, there's other reasons why people die. It's not just energy. People die from war.
Yeah, but this is one. The idea is you could have the nuclear power plants if this were an issue. I'm just saying there's this whole can't-do attitude when it comes to technologies people have biases against. So it's like, oh, well, someone's going to get cancer if they're 100 feet away. Well, move everyone. If that were true, move everyone 10,000 feet away. So the thing with radiation, I should just say with nuclear in terms of just the facts about it. So fossil fuels are interesting because one of the variables involved, CO2, because it goes in the entire atmosphere, and because we don't really understand the atmosphere too well, there's a lot of uncertainty in what happens there. What happens with nuclear, there's no uncertainty at all. It has a direct amount of radiation that can come out under a given circumstance. And at a certain level, that can be deadly, and at a certain level, that can be nothing and somewhat argued. So the best explanation ever of what this means with the nuclear power plant is the physicist Edward Teller, who did a lot of amazing things. He explained that this is a little bit lewd, sorry, but he explained that basically if you sleep next to a woman, you'll get slightly less radiation than you will from living next to a nuclear power plant, from the potassium in her body. So the lesson he drew was that sleeping with one woman is okay, but sleeping with two women is very dangerous. So that's the amount of radiation you're talking about. But what I'm saying is that the animus toward nuclear can't be explained by this. So any other thoughts? Yes, the student there. You.
Okay, so you seem to just think that it was so easy to pick these people up and move them, but like some of them can't afford to move, so like why are you asking them to like, why are you in like a first world country saying, like, hey, these people in these poor countries, like, we're gonna stick like the nuclear power plants by them, and then we're gonna expect them to just uproot their lives, like.
Well, actually, if there was, first of all, it's a made-up issue. But if it wasn't a made-up issue, what I'm saying is you would precisely stick it where they weren't. That's what I'm saying.
But what do you do? What do you do with like the plants? Like, how do you justify the plants that like are already in existence that end up? giving nuclear radiation to like thousands of people when something goes wrong.
Well, you've given nuclear radiation to thousands of people.
And very, very slight levels.
Same with the plants.
But how come people who live around these plants are getting diseases?
But this is something that somebody made up that he repeated.
No.
It's not true, but I'm saying, all I'm saying, like, I want to think of it in this context again. If our goal is really to address this massive human problem, we need to find cheap, plentiful, reliable energy sources. And then if we say we're going to constrain that by CO2 is this life and death problem, which I should talk about soon whether it is. If we're going to constrain that, then you would have to say, well, we got to figure out the best way to use nuclear and hydro, given that the alternative is mass suffering and starvation from energy poverty, or allegedly mass Armageddon from CO2. So in that case, you'd be willing to take on quite a bit of risk. So it's not, if we say, well, we have these two catastrophes, but we can't dam a river, which is hydro, or we can't build a nuclear power plant, what I'm saying is we're not sincere about it. And so these questions, in my view, are just confirmation of, not all, but this is not something we really take seriously. There are people right now, babies are dying for lack of incubators, and nobody really cares. Yes?
Well, the very reason why in Minnesota and Iowa we've been pro-ethanol.
Mm-hmm.
We burn our food,
Mm-hmm.
produce energy.
Yeah.
And the consequence has been the rise of price of food, and African babies have died.
Sure.
Because we believe in ethanol,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we've stopped subsidizing that now in Minnesota at any rate. And I think the federal subsidies have weighed up, but the mandates are still there. We're still mandating ethanol. We're still burning our food, and people in Africa are dying because of the price of food.
Mm-hmm.
And why the question you asked, why aren't the elite intellectuals complaining? Because the farmers of Iowa and Minnesota don't complain.
Right.
Right, so it's...
But somebody could point out that they were engaging in deadly behavior, and then they would be shamed, and then that would be justified. Okay, one more, and then I give my answer.
I think the easiest answer is that it's become morally superior for us to say, like, oh, we need renewables, we need to change our energy policy, not realizing the disproportionate effect that it has on developing nations, or nations that can't just choose to install energy that isn't actually sufficient for their energy needs. And so we live in a country where we have, albeit a slight energy abundance. Then there's countries like you had talked about earlier that can't even run one incubator and run as many as they want to. And so when we say, oh, we need more of a focus on renewables, we need more of a focus on solar energy and wind energy, we have the ability to produce those when developing countries don't. But it's morally superior for us to be like, oh, everybody should be using these types of energy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, although we use very tiny percentages of it. Nobody uses all unreliables or renewables. So I'm going to give you my answer, which is harsh. I don't believe that our society cares about human beings. And I don't think that most of you care about human beings. So that's a very mean and alienating thing for a speaker to say. In the following sense. What it means to care about something is for it to be a very clear goal in your mind, and then to be clearly manifested in action. And what can happen all the time in societies is that people get distracted by goals that they think should be their priority and that have nothing to do with human well-being or even contradict it. So for instance, ask why do we look at all the previous societies, so many previous societies, and think those guys were idiots, right? Those guys were jerks. Like those people in Germany, that would never be us, right? We would never do that. We would never kill all those Jews. If we were in Russia, we would never kill all those people of every kind. If we were in China, we'd never starve 40 million people. Sort of think like, why is it that people do these things? They're genetically the same as us. We can all pretend that we're, why do people love slavery? And I think it's ultimately because they have a goal that is an anti-human goal. So in the case of Germany and Russia, they had a goal which was the individual human lives don't matter. All that matters is the group. And that's manifested in the form of the state. So in Germany, all that mattered is German greatness. And so that then, they think that they care about human beings, but in reality that meant whatever German greatness gets contradicted by, including all these Jews without blonde hair and blue eyes, that has to go. Or in the Soviet Union, if you want to speak your mind, you have to go because you're against Soviet greatness. Or if you're wealthy, you have to go because you're against the proletariat. So in our culture, we have, I think, an incredibly anti-human goal that we treat as uncontroversial that guides almost all of our actions. And that is the goal of being green, what's called environmentalism, which I think is a very bad name for it. So being green means to minimize our impact on the planet. And this is an uncontroversial thing. I mean, any university, we're minimizing our impact. We want to be natural, we want to live in harmony with nature. You go to Whole Foods. Why does Whole Foods make so much money? Because overwhelmingly, we want to be green. It's just this is the least controversial thing in our culture. So when I hear an idea, as a philosopher, I want to know, what does this idea really mean? So if we really wanted to minimize our impact on nature, let's say we take this ideal seriously, well, if we had wanted to do that several hundred years ago, would we have taken a patch of dirt and trees and turned it into New York City? So if we could bring the Sierra Club and Greenpeace back when we were deciding whether to build New York, would they have given it thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, what about having a kid? If you want to minimize your impact on the planet, should you self-replicate one or more times? Seriously, should you? That is the worst thing that you could ever do for the planet. If you think of the planet as something separate from and superior to you. Sierra Club tells young women that, how our carbon footprint is supposed to be our goal in life, is to have as low a one as possible. Sierra Club tells young women that if you have a kid, your carbon legacy, just one, will increase by a factor of 6. That's your carbon footprint over time. So what about this? If our goal is to minimize our impact on the planet, which is a more moral country, North Korea or South Korea? Have you ever seen them at night?
Yeah.
So North Korea is really dark. There's one light for Kim's mansion. South Korea. So which is a more moral country? Which has less impact on the planet? Well, someone said Cuba, but of North Korea or South Korea? North Korea has much less impact. Now here's the interesting question. Which country has a better environment? North Korea or South Korea? South Korea, you'd much rather live there, right? As cleaner air, cleaner water, better sanitation, better health. You're a lot safer from climate. So what's going on here? What's going on here is that our ideal as a society in terms of our relationship with nature is completely wrong. It's just absolutely wrong and self-destructive to think of it as we want to minimize our impact. Because human beings are impactors by nature. We survive by impacting, by transforming the planet to meet our needs. That's how we take a planet that naturally gives us a poor standard of living and turn it into a planet that blooms and gives us a good standard of living. So what we need to do is we need to be intelligent in how we impact. We need to transform it intelligently, but we need to do it on a massive scale. And so the way I think of it is the goal should not be, our goal as a society needs to change from minimizing human impact to maximizing human flourishing, which means allowing individuals to reach their fullest potential. So I don't want the earth with the least human impact. I want the earth that most fosters human flourishing. So I don't think of human beings as unnatural, as not part of nature. I think of us as the best part of nature. And when I think if the Martians looked at us, they wouldn't say, oh, they're unnatural, oh, they're disgusting. I think they would say they build the best nests. That's how I think of it. So I don't think we should think of our creations as bad. I think we should create really intelligently, just one second, to maximize human flourishing. Yes?
Do you see those two as naturally opposing?
They are overwhelmingly contradictory, so there's a very small intersection. So the issue with impact is if you want to maximize human flourishing, the relation to impact is you want to minimize your anti-human impacts, right? So you want to you want to minimize, say, like soot in your lungs, but you want to maximize your positive impacts. And so if we get to this issue of solar and wind and nuclear and hydro, and why are the Greens opposed to all the most effective sources of energy? Well, the ultimate reason is because energy is impact. Energy is our capacity. It's our literal capacity to exert force times distance. It's our capacity to impact the earth. That's what energy does. It moves things around in a way that they weren't before. Energy is impact. So if you're against impact, you're going to always have a resistance to using large amounts of energy. Now, if you're a movement and you tell everyone, hey, and you really want to minimize human impact and you don't really value human life, and you want to tell everyone, you want to get everyone to give up their energy, one thing you do is say, hey, I don't like energy very much. And that probably wouldn't go over too well. So what you can say instead is, hey, you know the kind of energy that you're really benefiting from? It turns out that in 30 years, it's going to be really bad for you, right? So that's what they did with nuclear, that's what they do. So they always have a reason why it's bad. And what's interesting is that the Green Movement has only supported in its entire history one form of energy consistently, and that is imaginary energy. Seriously, so when the Green Movement was attacking nuclear, it supported coal. When it was attacking coal, it supported gas. And now it's attacking gas as fracking, as it becomes practical. And even with solar and wind, the biggest opponent of solar and wind projects are green activists. Go to projectnoproject.com. And you can see, and why do they say the projects are bad? Because they have impact. And if you know how they work, solar and wind have the most impact in terms of geographic impact because the energy is so dilute and you need so many of them. So this is a completely bankrupt ideal. The ideal we need to think about all these important issues, including the climate issue, is the human flourishing ideal. So my own focus is, I think today's environmental movement is backwards. It's an anti-human environmental movement, and I think it needs to be replaced by a pro-human environmental movement. So I call that the human flourishing movement. So if you're interested in that, which I hope you are, particularly because the more young people, the better, you can sign up at humanflourishingmovement.com. We have cards down there, so I can send you a couple of resources on that, and you can get on our list. It's, for me, this is just about the most important thing, because if we relate to nature and our environment in the wrong way, whether we ruin it for ourselves or whether we prevent ourselves from being productive, it's incredibly destructive, including energy poverty. But if we learn how to use it really intelligently, so we have the best economy and the best environment possible, then I think the progress we have today will be nothing compared to what we have in decades. So I think that there's just this incredible potential overall, and the first people that will benefit from that are the people we've talked about today, the people who experience energy poverty. So I hope that today has given you a little bit of a picture of why that's an important issue, and why the ultimate solution to it is not just supporting fossil fuels, supporting nuclear, but ultimately supporting human flourishing. So with that, thank you, and I'll take questions if anyone has any.